What would you do if a stranger looked you in the eye and decided you didn't belong? Would you speak up? Would you fight back, or would you stay silent, knowing the world was watching? On flight AS921 from San Francisco to New York, a 17-year-old black girl quietly settled into her first-class seat. She had the ticket. She had the right to be there. But, in less than a minute, a white passenger's voice cut through the calm, questioning her presence, doubting her worth, and insisting she move. What no one knew was that this young woman wasn't just a passenger. She was Naomi Ellison, the CEO and majority shareholder of Atlas Skyways, and the decision she made in that cabin would shake the entire airline industry. How did a single confrontation in the air turn into a movement on the ground? What happened when the truth came out? And why are people still talking about Flight AS921 today? Stay with me. You're about to hear the full story. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss these powerful stories. The first-class cabin of Atlas Skyways Flight AS921 to New York was still waking up, the kind of quiet that happens just after boarding when passengers settle in, order coffee, and pretend not to notice each other. Through the wide A350 windows, pale gold sunlight spilled across polished wood accents and soft cream leather seats. The air smelled faintly of fresh espresso and warm croissants, a small detail that most people wouldn't notice, but Naomi Ellison did. She noticed everything. Naomi sat in Suite 1A, the most expensive and most private seat on the aircraft. It was a small enclosed space with sliding doors, a leather armchair that could flatten into a bed, and a personal 32-inch screen. To anyone glancing in from the aisle, she might have looked out of place 17 years old, wearing a crisp white school shirt, navy blazer, and pleated skirt. Her hair was neatly braided back, and on the table in front of her was not a phone or a fashion magazine, but a tablet filled with financial reports. Her right hand moved slowly across the screen, highlighting sections of an acquisition proposal that would have made most Wall Street executives blink twice. Her left hand rested on a slim folder beside her. Inside was a scholarship letter from MIT. Her name printed in bold type. She had learned to keep her expression neutral in public spaces. Growing up, she had found that people made fewer assumptions if they couldn't read her emotions. But today, behind the calm exterior, Naomi was running through the numbers of a merger deal that could shift Atlas Skyways' market position for the next decade. The gentle click of high heels on the carpet pulled her out of the spreadsheet. She glanced up. A woman in her mid-50s approached from the aisle, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, her tailored navy dress matched with a silk scarf, and a deep green Hermes bag tucked under one arm. Margaret Hensley didn't just walk, she moved like the cabin belonged to her. Margaret slowed beside Naomi's suite and gave a quick glance at the seat number. Her eyes swept over Naomi, pausing for a fraction of a second on the school uniform. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she said, her tone sugar-coated but lined with steel. "I think there's been some kind of mix-up here. This is first class. Not—" Her voice trailed off, her gaze resting on Naomi's blazer as if it confirmed whatever she was thinking. "Not where you're supposed to be." The words hung in the air between them. A few passengers in nearby suites turned their heads. The quiet murmur of early morning conversation faded, replaced by the subtle pressure of people listening. Naomi's fingers brushed against the edge of her boarding pass, still resting in the side pocket of the seat. She knew exactly what it said, Suite 1A, first class, San Francisco to New York, paid in full, but she also knew that showing the pass wasn't really what Margaret was asking for. Her voice stayed level. "My ticket is correct, ma'am." Margaret's expression didn't soften. If anything, the disbelief sharpened. "I've been flying this route for years," she said, straightening her scarf. "I've never seen a high school student sitting up here alone. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Naomi kept her eyes steady. "Yes." Margaret tilted her head slightly, as if Naomi's composure was somehow an act of defiance. "Well, perhaps we should get this sorted out. First class has certain standards." The last word landed like a stone. In Suite 2A, Ruth Calderon looked up from her newspaper. At 75, the retired civil rights attorney had heard enough versions of this kind of exchange to recognize where it was heading. Across the aisle, Dr. Adrian Morales paused mid-sentence on a phone call, his eyes flicking toward the interaction. Jonathan Reeves, 3 seats back, stopped scrolling on his laptop. Naomi kept her voice calm. "I've shown you my seat number. That should be enough." Margaret pressed her lips together. "I'm going to ask the flight attendant to check your boarding pass, just to be sure." She reached up and pressed the call button. The soft electronic chime rang through the cabin. Moments later, Lena Park appeared, her dark hair pulled neatly into a bun, her Atlas Skyways uniform crisp. She smiled politely, but her eyes darted between the two women, picking up on the tension immediately. "How can I help you today, Mrs. Hensley?" "This passenger," Margaret said, gesturing toward Naomi as though she were pointing out a misplaced suitcase, "is in first class. I think there's been a mix-up. Could you check her boarding pass and help her find her correct seat?" Lena's professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Of course. Miss, may I see your boarding pass? Please." Naomi handed it over without hesitation, along with her photo ID. She didn't offer the scholarship letter. That detail was hers to share or not. Lena scanned the documents, then looked up. "Everything appears to be in order. Suite 1A is indeed her seat." Margaret's brows drew together. "That's unexpected. How does a teenager afford first class? Is she some kind of scholarship student being treated to a fancy trip? If so, she should understand that first class has certain expectations." Naomi's patience tightened around the edges. She was used to small assumptions, the kind people might make in a store or a hotel lobby, but this being called out in front of a cabin full of strangers was sharper. She considered ending it here, but part of her wanted to see where Margaret would take it. The cabin seemed to lean in, the hum of the engines filling the silence. Naomi set her tablet down slowly, her gaze steady on Margaret. "I have complied with every request and shown proof of my seat. What more do you need?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She glanced toward Lena. "I think we should have the captain take a look at this. It's unusual." Naomi exhaled through her nose, the calm surface of her expression hiding the swirl beneath calculation, mild disbelief, and a growing curiosity about just how far this woman was willing to go. This wasn't the first time someone had questioned whether she belonged in a space like this. But something about the way the entire cabin had gone silent made it different, more visible, more instructive. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over a contact. Not yet, she thought. Let it play out a little longer. The quiet hum of the engines was suddenly louder in Naomi's ears. as though the aircraft itself was listening. Lena still held the boarding pass in her hand, her eyes on Margaret, who stood with her arms crossed and her chin lifted just enough to signal she would not be satisfied so easily. "Mrs. Hensley," Lena said carefully, "I've confirmed that Miss Ellison's boarding pass and ID are valid. There's no mistake with her seat assignment." Margaret smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I understand what you're saying, but it still doesn't add up. A high school student traveling alone in first class is unusual. There are security concerns when something doesn't match the usual pattern." Naomi sat perfectly still. Inside, a mix of irritation and curiosity churned. She thought of the board meeting she was scheduled to attend after landing. There, she would be surrounded by executives decades older than her, and she would command the room without question. But here, in this enclosed cabin, she was being measured by her uniform, her skin, and her age. Margaret turned slightly, her voice just loud enough for others to hear. "When you've been a first-class passenger as long as I have, you notice when things are out of place." Naomi caught the subtle glances from nearby suites. Ruth Calderon's gaze was fixed on Margaret, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Morales had set his phone down entirely, his fingers resting against his chin. Jonathan Reeves was leaning slightly forward in his seat, as though ready to intervene. "I'll ask again," Margaret said, looking directly at Lena now. "Can you please call the captain? This is a safety matter." Lena hesitated. Naomi saw it in the way her hands tightened against the boarding pass before returning it to Naomi. Protocol was clear any declared passenger safety concern, no matter how unfounded, had to be addressed. Still, Lena's expression carried the weight of knowing this wasn't about safety at all. "I'll speak to the captain," Lena said finally, her voice clipped with professionalism. She turned and walked toward the cockpit, her steps brisk. Margaret gave Naomi another long look. "You should understand. I'm not trying to cause trouble for you, but there are certain spaces where standards have to be maintained." Naomi met her gaze without flinching. "And who decides those standards?" Margaret blinked, as if startled by the question. "The airline, of course, and the customers who pay for the experience." Naomi wanted to smile at the irony, if only Margaret knew, but instead she let silence hang between them. Silence was often more powerful than words. The moment stretched until Lena returned, this time accompanied by Captain Thomas Keating. The captain's uniform was immaculate, his expression measured, his posture carrying the quiet authority of a man who had flown through every kind of turbulence imaginable. "Good morning," he said, addressing both women. "I understand there's a concern about seating arrangements." Margaret's confidence sharpened at his arrival. "Yes, Captain, I've asked your staff to verify this young woman's seat. While her boarding pass says 1A, I'm questioning the legitimacy of her ticket. I've never seen an unaccompanied teenager in first class, and I think it's worth confirming how she came to be here." Naomi noted the subtle tightening around the captain's eyes. He was already recognizing the shape of this conversation. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "has this passenger behaved in a way that concerns you? Any threats, inappropriate language, or actions?" Margaret hesitated, clearly aware she had no such claim. "No, but the situation itself is suspicious. Standards matter, Captain. This cabin is meant for passengers who meet those standards." It was Ruth Calderon who spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of decades in courtrooms. "Captain, What I'm hearing is not a legitimate safety concern, but a subjective judgment based on appearance. This young woman has provided valid identification and a valid ticket. There's no reason for this conversation to continue." Margaret turned sharply toward Ruth. "With all due respect, this affects all of us. We pay for an exclusive experience. When that is compromised, When it is compromised, Jonathan Reeves interrupted from his seat, his tone edged with disbelief. "You mean when someone you didn't expect to see in first class sits next to you? That's not a compromise. That's your bias talking." Dr. Morales leaned forward slightly. "I've been observing since this began. There is nothing here except an assumption that because she's young and black, she doesn't belong. That assumption is dangerous." Naomi felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin shift toward her. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Part of her wanted to end this now, to reveal who she was and shut it down. But another part, the part that understood leadership, knew that allowing the situation to unfold might expose something more important than her own dignity. Captain Keating's gaze moved between them. "Mrs. Hensley, unless you can present a concrete security concern, I will consider this matter resolved." Margaret's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. "Then I request a full verification of her background. I want to know exactly how she obtained this seat." Naomi's fingers brushed her phone again. She could end this with one call to Denise Clark, and the cabin would see just how misplaced Margaret's assumptions had been. But a stronger impulse kept her still. She glanced at Ruth Calderon, who gave her a nearly imperceptible nod of support. Jonathan's eyes were steady on hers, and even Dr. Morales's expression carried quiet encouragement. They were waiting to see how she would play this. Inside, Naomi was running the calculation. If she ended it now, she would protect herself but lose the teachable moment. If she let it run longer, the discomfort in the cabin would grow, but so would the clarity about what was really happening. The choice wasn't simple. Her mind flashed back to being 11 years old, standing in a boarding line for a flight to Boston, when a man had tried to send her to the economy queue because he knew she didn't belong in business class. That sting had stayed with her. She straightened in her seat and looked at Margaret. "You're asking for proof beyond what the airline itself requires. That says more about you than it does about me." Margaret opened her mouth, but Naomi raised her hand just slightly, not in a gesture of dismissal, but one of control. "If you insist on verification, you'll get it, but be prepared for the answer." The hum of the engines filled the pause. Naomi could feel the moment tipping, the energy in the cabin pulling toward the inevitable reveal. Naomi kept her gaze steady on Margaret, but she could feel the subtle changes in the room. Conversations in other suites had gone silent. A faint shift in posture, the leaning forward of bodies, the shared glances. Everyone was now invested in what was unfolding. Lena Park remained near the aisle, her hands clasped in front of her, caught between duty and discomfort. She had followed Atlas Skyways customer service protocol for 2 years, and she knew it by heart. The rulebook was clear: a safety concern, any safety concern had to be addressed, no matter how unlikely. But what she saw now wasn't safety. It was something else, something uglier. "Captain," Margaret said, turning her body slightly toward Thomas Keating, "I don't think it's unreasonable to expect a higher level of verification in a situation like this. First class is meant for passengers who meet certain standards." Naomi's fingers tightened around the armrest. That word again. Standards. In her mind, it echoed with the same sharpness as every time someone had implied she didn't fit the picture of success. She had heard it in job interviews her mother went to when Naomi was still a child. She had heard it from a guidance counselor who suggested she aim for realistic colleges. And she had heard it in the boarding line that day when she was 11, being told she was in the wrong place. The captain's tone was calm, but edged with finality. "Mrs. Hensley, we've confirmed this passenger's ticket and ID. That's the airline's standard for verification." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Then perhaps the airline's standards need reviewing. That was enough to draw a reaction from Jonathan Reeves, who leaned forward in his seat. "What exactly are you suggesting? That anyone you think doesn't belong here should have to explain themselves to you?" Margaret ignored him, focusing instead on Lena. "I want you to run a background check." Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose. She felt her pulse in her temples, but her voice was steady. "You want a background check on me? In front of all these people?" Margaret's voice softened, but it was the softness of someone trying to disguise control as kindness. "I just want to be sure that you're supposed to be here. That's all. That's all," Naomi repeated quietly, as though testing the words. Ruth Calderon's voice cut in from 2 rows back. "What you're doing is harassment. This young woman has complied with every request. She has shown valid documents. Continuing to demand more is no longer about procedure. It's about your perception of who belongs in first class," Dr. Morales added. "And that perception is biased. I've worked in hospitals for over 20 years. I've seen what happens when bias shapes decision-making. It's never harmless." The cabin's energy was shifting, but Margaret was unmoved. She adjusted the scarf at her neck and glanced at the captain again. "If this is really no issue, then a background check will prove it. That's all I'm asking." Naomi's hand slid into the side pocket of her seat and closed around her phone. She didn't move yet, but she felt the weight of it like a switch she could flip at any moment. She thought of Denise Clark, her executive assistant, who would answer on the first ring. She pictured the room Denise worked from floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the Bay Bridge, a desk stacked with contracts that Naomi had personally signed. She also thought of the other passengers watching now. The expressions varied, some curious, some uneasy, some openly supportive, but all were witnessing the same thing. If she ended it now, they would know Margaret was wrong. But would they understand why she was wrong? Margaret's voice intruded on her thoughts. "I've been loyal to this airline for 15 years. I know what the first-class experience is supposed to be. I've never once questioned another passenger until now." "Doesn't that tell you something?" Naomi looked up at her. "It tells me you're willing to create a scene over an assumption." Jonathan Reeves gave a small laugh, though it carried no humor. "Exactly. You're not protecting the standards, you're protecting your comfort zone." Margaret bristled. "I'm protecting the integrity of the cabin." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "What exactly do you think would happen if someone you didn't expect to see here turned out to be exactly where they were meant to be?" Margaret didn't answer, and Naomi knew she wouldn't. Lena took a small step forward, her voice softer now. "Miss Ellison, would you like me to bring you something to drink while this is being sorted out?" Naomi appreciated the gesture, even if it was wrapped in the politeness of service. "No, thank you," she said, her gaze still locked on Margaret. The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind that sometimes filled first class. This one was heavier, charged, the kind of silence that makes people lean in, even if they know they shouldn't. Naomi's internal voice was running two scripts at once. The first was the practical plan called Denise, put her on speaker, let her confirm Naomi's position at Atlas Skyways, and watch the situation collapse in seconds. The second was the strategist's plan. Wait. Let the discomfort grow. Let the bias reveal itself fully so that when she acted, there would be no question what had just happened. She could feel her decision settling. She would let it play out a little longer. Captain Keating shifted his weight slightly, reading the room. Mrs. Hensley, unless you have a legitimate safety concern, I consider this resolved. Margaret inhaled as though about to speak, then exhaled sharply. Then you leave me no choice but to escalate this through other channels. I'll be contacting corporate. Naomi almost smiled at that. Contacting corporate? She wondered what Margaret's face would look like when she realized exactly who corporate was. Lena glanced at Naomi, the faintest question in her eyes. Naomi gave the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. The captain nodded once and excused himself, heading back toward the cockpit. Lena followed, her posture straight, her pace measured. Margaret lingered for another moment, perhaps waiting for Naomi to break the silence. But Naomi simply reached for her tablet again, opening the same financial document she had been reviewing before the interruption. She read without rushing, highlighting a section on projected revenue growth, fully aware that the act of ignoring Margaret now was its own quiet statement. When Margaret finally stepped back toward her own seat, the cabin seemed to exhale. Ruth picked up her newspaper again, though her eyes still flicked toward Naomi. Dr. Morales reached for his coffee, shaking his head slightly. Jonathan tapped something into his phone, perhaps a message to someone about what he'd just witnessed. Naomi kept reading, her breathing steady, but inside she was counting down. She knew the moment was coming, the one where the balance of this conversation would shift completely. And when it did, it would not just be about her. It would be about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong in a place they had every right to be. Naomi's fingers hovered over her phone again, the cool glass against her skin feeling almost like a trigger waiting to be pulled. She could make the call now, end this whole performance in a matter of seconds, but that wasn't what her instincts told her to do. Not yet. She glanced sideways and caught Jonathan Reeves watching her closely. He gave her the smallest nod, as if to say, "You're in control here." Across the aisle, Ruth Calderon's expression was all quiet resolve, her lips pressed together, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. Dr. Morales sat back in his seat but didn't look away. Every single one of them was waiting to see what she would do. Margaret Hensley, on the other hand, was clearly not waiting for anything. She leaned slightly into the aisle, her voice pitched just loud enough for the first-class cabin to hear. You see, this is the problem when rules aren't applied consistently. It undermines the value of the service for everyone else. Naomi felt a flicker of heat in her chest. The words weren't even subtle anymore. They were designed to plant an idea in the minds of those listening, to frame her presence here as a breach of something sacred. She wondered if Margaret even realized how transparent she had become. Lena Park reappeared from the galley, a tray in her hands. She placed a glass of sparkling water on Naomi's table with a quiet, "Here you go, Miss Ellison," and a slight emphasis on the miss, as if to affirm that she belonged. Naomi gave her a small, grateful nod. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Oh, so now we're offering special treatment." Ruth's head turned sharply. "Mrs. Hensley, enough." Margaret looked back at her, unbothered. "I'm simply pointing out what everyone is thinking. It's not personal." Jonathan's voice cut through the air. "It's entirely personal. You've made it that way from the moment you walked over to her seat." The hum of the engines filled the pause. Naomi took a sip of water, her gaze on Margaret, steady and calm. Inside, her thoughts were running faster than her heartbeat. She'd been here before, different cities, different settings, same undercurrent. She remembered the time in a high-end hotel lobby when a man had asked her to carry his bags because he assumed she was staff. She remembered a conference where another CEO had handed her his coat without thinking. She remembered the sting of being underestimated, dismissed, questioned not for what she had done, but for what she looked like. And she remembered the promise she had made to herself the next time someone tried to shrink her in public. She wouldn't just defend herself. She would make the moment count. Captain Keating emerged from the cockpit again, his voice steady but with a faint edge of weariness. "Is everything under control here?" Margaret turned to him immediately. "No, Captain, it's not. I don't feel comfortable with this passenger's presence in first class without a proper verification process. This isn't about her, personally, it's about the integrity of the cabin." Naomi could almost hear the collective exhale of disbelief from the passengers who had been watching from the start. Even the captain's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he answered. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "the only verification process required is the one we've already completed. Miss Ellison has a valid ticket and ID. There is no additional requirement." Margaret didn't back down. "Then I'll take this up with corporate when we land." Naomi smiled slightly, a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. "I think you should do that," she said softly. Margaret blinked, thrown by the response. "Excuse me," Naomi's voice remained calm. "I think you should take it up with corporate. In fact, I can help you reach the right person." Ruth shifted forward in her seat, sensing a change. Jonathan's eyes flicked between Naomi and Margaret. Even Lena paused mid-step, waiting. Naomi picked up her phone. The screen lit up, her home screen simple and uncluttered, a single row of important contacts at the top. She tapped one name. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Clear and professional. Atlas Skyways Executive Office. Denise Clark speaking. Naomi pressed the speaker icon, letting the voice carry through the cabin. "Denise, it's Naomi. I'm currently on flight AS921 and there's a passenger here who has some concerns about my right to be seated in first class." There was a pause, just long enough for the implication to register. When Denise spoke again, her voice had shifted into a different register, formal, protective, tinged with outrage held tightly in check. "Miss Ellison, are you telling me someone is questioning your seating assignment?" "Yes," Naomi said, repeatedly. Another pause. Then, "Should I inform security that the CEO of Atlas Skyways is being harassed on her own aircraft?" The silence in the cabin was almost physical. Naomi could see it hit Margaret, the stiffening of her shoulders, the slight widening of her eyes, the color draining from her face. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then looked around as though searching for some escape route from the weight of what she had just heard. Naomi kept her eyes on her. "Denise, please document this interaction and forward it to the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Include the passenger's full name and seat number." "Understood," Denise said. "Do you require legal to be notified immediately?" Not yet, Naomi replied. Let's start with the report. She ended the call and set the phone down gently on the table. For a moment, no one moved. The engines hummed, the air vents whispered, and the weight of revelation settled into every corner of the cabin. Naomi picked up her tablet again and swiped to a Forbes magazine cover featuring her own face. The headline reading Naomi Ellison, Aviation's Young Visionary. She held it up for the nearest passengers to see. This, she said, her voice carrying easily in the quiet, is who I am. I am the majority shareholder and CEO of Atlas Skyways. I set the standards you're so concerned about, Mrs. Hensley, and I assure you, you've just failed to meet them. Margaret sank slowly back into her seat, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Her lips moved once as though she might speak, but no words came. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and everyone in the cabin felt it. For several seconds after Naomi's words, the cabin stayed completely still. The moment seemed to hang in the air, the hum of the engines almost deafening in the absence of conversation. Naomi had just reset the balance of power so completely that the change was visible in the way people were sitting. Margaret Hensley's back no longer carried the rigid authority she had displayed when she approached Suite 1A. Now, her posture sagged slightly as though the weight of the revelation had settled on her shoulders. Her eyes darted to Ruth Calderon, to Jonathan Reeves, to Dr. Morales, searching for some kind of anchor. But all she found were steady gazes that told her the tide had turned. Jonathan broke the silence first. I have to admit, Miss Ellison, I thought about stepping in sooner. I didn't, and I regret that. You handled this better than most adults I've ever met. Ruth folded her newspaper with precise care. You were patient far longer than the situation deserved. I've spent a lifetime in courtrooms watching people reveal their prejudices without even realizing it. Mrs. Hensley, what you've demonstrated today is textbook. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally spoke in a voice that was far smaller than before. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean... She trailed off, her words collapsing under the weight of their own inadequacy. Naomi kept her tone even. That's the point. Mrs. Hensley, you didn't know who I was, but you decided who I couldn't be, and you did it loudly, in front of a cabin full of people. Dr. Morales shifted forward in his seat. This is exactly why bias training matters. People think they're just following their instincts, when in fact they're acting on assumptions they've never examined. Naomi leaned back slightly, her gaze moving across the cabin. She wanted everyone to hear this, not just Margaret. The reason I didn't end this right away is because I wanted the full shape of it to show. I wanted the people here to see what it looks like when someone is questioned, not because of what they've done, but because of how they look or who they are. Lena Park stood near the aisle, her hands folded in front of her. Miss Ellison, I want to apologize. I followed protocol, but I can see now that the protocol itself doesn't address situations like this. I should have recognized what was happening sooner. Naomi's voice softened. Lena, you treated me with respect, even while following the rules. The problem isn't you, it's the gaps in the system that leave room for bias to go unchecked. Captain Keating had returned quietly during the exchange, standing just behind Lena. Miss Ellison, I can promise you this incident will be fully documented and sent through every appropriate channel. What happened here doesn't reflect the values we want in our crews. Naomi looked at him. Captain, I believe you, but it does reflect something bigger, the reality that these moments happen more often than people realize, and not just here, in hotel lobbies, in boardrooms, in classrooms. People are told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. It chips away at dignity. Her eyes moved back to Margaret, who was now sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. You thought you were protecting a standard, but you were enforcing a barrier. The truth is, I wrote the standards for this cabin, and the first one is simple. Every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity from the moment they step on board, regardless of what they look like. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy now, it was reflective. Naomi could see the thoughtfulness in some of the faces around her. Even the man in 3B, who had been studiously avoiding involvement until now, gave a small nod. Jonathan spoke again, his tone lighter but sincere. I think we all just got a masterclass in leadership under pressure. Naomi let out a small breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had kept her composure, but the weight of the exchange was beginning to register in her chest. She sipped her water slowly, letting the moment breathe. Margaret's voice came again, hesitant. Miss Ellison, I truly didn't mean to offend you. I thought I was standing up for the standards I value. I can see now that I was wrong. Naomi studied her for a moment. This was the place where she could humiliate her if she chose, twist the knife while everyone was watching. But that had never been her goal. Her goal was to make the bias visible, not to destroy the person carrying it. It's not about me forgiving you, Naomi said. It's about what you do next. If this moment changes nothing for you, then it's wasted. If it makes you stop and think before you judge someone's place in a space, then it's worth something. Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the floor. Ruth's voice was softer now, but still edged with steel. Growth rarely comes without discomfort. Consider yourself fortunate to have had the lesson. Naomi reached into her tablet again, opening a presentation she had been preparing for a board meeting later that day. She turned it toward Ruth and Jonathan, the screen displaying a set of statistics. 73% of business travelers of color report experiencing discrimination in the aviation industry. In first-class cabins, the rate is over 300% higher than in economy. That's not a perception problem, that's a reality problem. Dr. Morales frowned, and yet people still say they've never seen it happen. Well, they can't say that anymore. Naomi closed the tablet. Exactly, and that's why I'll be making changes immediately. Mandatory unconscious bias training for all customer-facing staff, clear reporting mechanisms for passengers, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment disguised as concern. Lena straightened slightly, almost as if relieved to hear the words spoken aloud. Captain Keating gave a small nod of approval. Jonathan smiled faintly. I'd invest in that. Naomi met his gaze. You already have, if you fly with us. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted again. The earlier tension had eased, replaced by a shared understanding, some of it uncomfortable, but real. Margaret had gone quiet, not out of defiance this time, but because she had no defense left to stand on. Naomi knew the work wasn't done. One incident, no matter how public, wasn't enough to dismantle the quiet assumptions that shaped moments like this. But it was a start. And as long as she had a seat at the head of the table or in Suite 1A, she would use it. Naomi let the silence stretch just long enough to settle into everyone's bones. It was no longer the tense silence of suspicion. Now it was something heavier reflection. People were replaying the last 20 minutes in their minds. measuring their own thoughts against the truth that had just been laid bare. Margaret Hensley kept her gaze fixed on her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The sharpness in her posture had melted into something smaller, almost fragile. But Naomi knew that fragility didn't erase the damage. What mattered was whether Margaret would carry the lesson beyond this cabin. Naomi spoke again, her voice low but carrying. This isn't just about one person's words. It's about a pattern that repeats itself over and over. You've all just seen it in real time. And the truth is, it could happen to anyone who doesn't fit someone else's picture of who belongs here. Jonathan Reeves leaned back in his seat, still watching her closely. The thing is, most of us never get to see the whole arc. We hear about situations like this in headlines, maybe in a friend's story, but not start to finish. We saw it this time because you let it happen. That was intentional, Naomi said. Ending it early would have made me feel better in the moment, but it wouldn't have shown the rest of you how bias sounds, how it moves, how it escalates. Ruth Calderon's expression softened into something close to pride. You were patient enough to let the truth walk itself into the open. That's not easy, especially when the truth is cutting into you while you wait. Dr. Morales nodded, and that's where the real work is. You can't change what you don't acknowledge. Seeing it unfold makes it impossible to deny. Lena Park stepped closer to Naomi's suite, her voice a little quieter now, but still carrying to those who were listening. Miss Ellison, if you're going to make changes to the system, I want to help. I've seen smaller versions of this happen before, but they don't always reach the point where they can be addressed. Naomi turned toward her. You'll have that chance, starting today. This airline will adopt a zero-tolerance policy for harassment of any passenger, and we'll back our staff when they intervene, even if the situation is complicated. Lena's shoulders loosened a fraction. That would mean a lot to the crew. It'll mean more to the passengers who never know they'll need it, Naomi said. Margaret finally looked up, her voice quieter than before. I've been flying this airline for years. I've defended it when people complained about service. And now I see I wasn't defending the airline. I was defending my version of it. I'm sorry. Naomi met her gaze for a moment, searching for sincerity. Then make the apology worth something. Tell people what you saw here. Not just what happened to you, what you did. If you have the courage to do that, you'll help more than you realize. Margaret gave a small nod, not quite able to answer aloud. The captain stepped forward again, his presence drawing attention back toward the front of the cabin. Miss Ellison, I'll make sure this incident is logged in detail. But if you'd like to add a direct statement for the record, I can have it transmitted before we land. Naomi shook her head slightly. I'll do more than a statement. We'll use this as a case study for training. Every staff member in this airline will learn from this moment. Jonathan let out a short breath of something that was half a laugh, half admiration. You're going to turn a first-class spat into corporate training. That's efficient leadership. Naomi smiled faintly. I prefer to call it not wasting an opportunity. The cabin began to shift again, not in tension this time, but in atmosphere. The strangers who had been silent observers were now participants, even if only in thought. Some faces held guilt for not speaking sooner, others a kind of wary respect. A few looked as though they were reconsidering their own travel habits, the times they might have let something slide without noticing it. Ruth glanced toward Margaret. When we land, Mrs. Hensley, I'd suggest you put this into your own words. The people who need to hear it won't listen to Naomi the way they'll listen to you. That's the irony." Margaret's mouth tightened slightly, but she nodded again. Naomi reached for her tablet once more, pulling up a new document. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen as she drafted the framework for what she had just promised. Bias training, reporting channels, staff empowerment. It wasn't the kind of thing most CEOs would start sketching mid-flight, but Naomi knew the urgency of acting while the reality was still fresh in her mind and in everyone else's. Dr. Morales leaned slightly into the aisle. "Miss Ellison, if you ever want a physician's perspective for your training modules, call me. Hospitals deal with bias constantly, and the lessons apply across industries." Naomi looked up from her tablet and gave him a small smile. "I'll take you up on that." Lena lingered a moment longer. "I'll start drafting scenarios for cabin crew training, real situations, not just scripted ones. This will be one of them." "It should be," Naomi said. "The point isn't to shame anyone, it's to make sure the next time this happens, it ends before it begins." The captain checked his watch. Then the cabin. "We'll be starting our descent in about 2 hours. Miss Ellison, if there's anything you need before then, just let me know." Naomi shook her head. "You've both done enough by listening and being willing to act. That's where it starts." Jonathan Reeves was still watching her, that calculating look of a man who recognized strategic thinking when he saw it. "You know, this is going to go beyond Atlas Skyways, right? Once this story gets out, other airlines will have to look at their own policies." "That's the idea," Naomi said simply. For a while, the cabin returned to something like normal. Coffee cups were refilled, tablets lit up again, seat adjustments hummed softly. But beneath the quiet, Naomi could feel the change. People were more aware of each other now. The invisible lines of separation drawn earlier had blurred. She tapped a final note into her tablet before setting it aside. The work she was starting here wasn't just about making a statement. It was about changing the conditions that allowed moments like this to happen. And that work, she knew, would never be finished in a single flight. But as she glanced out at the bright sweep of sky beyond the window, she thought maybe it could start here. The hum of the engines had settled into the background again, but it wasn't the same hum as before. Something about the cabin felt different now. Naomi could sense it in the way passengers leaned into conversations instead of retreating into their private cocoons. The invisible tension lines that had been drawn at the start of the flight had blurred, replaced by a quiet, shared curiosity. Ruth Calderon, who had been watching Naomi with the practiced eyes of someone used to assessing witnesses in a courtroom, leaned over the aisle slightly. "You realize you've just given half this cabin a new way to see the world," she said. Naomi met her gaze. "I hope so. Otherwise, this will just be another story about a passenger making a scene, instead of the lesson it should be." Jonathan Reeves, who had been tapping away on his laptop, turned his screen slightly toward Naomi. It displayed a half-written blog post with the headline, "When Bias Boards the Plane With You." He grinned. "I write for a couple of tech leadership forums. I'd like to share what I saw here. No names unless you want them. But the lesson's too good to keep to myself." Naomi considered that. "If you share it, tell it truthfully. Not just what happened to me, but how people responded. Show the full picture. That's the only way it matters." Jonathan nodded. "You have my word." "Doctor." Morales cleared his throat gently. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. about letting it play out. It must have been difficult. Naomi took a breath before answering. It was. Every instinct told me to shut it down, but shutting it down would have made it about my status, not the principal. I wanted it to be clear that no one should have to justify their right to exist in a space they've already earned. Lena Park returned with a fresh pot of coffee, offering refills to anyone who wanted one. When she reached Naomi's suite, she lingered just a little longer than necessary. "I meant it earlier," she said quietly. "I want to help with the training program. What I saw today, I don't want to see again." "You'll get that chance," Naomi assured her. Across the cabin, Margaret sat in silence, her gaze on the seat back in front of her. She looked smaller now, her designer scarf slightly askew, her once perfect posture bent forward. Naomi noticed her, shifting in her seat as if she wanted to say something but couldn't yet find the words. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice low enough that Naomi had to lean slightly to hear. "I keep replaying it. The way I spoke to you, I thought I was being civil. I wasn't. I thought I was defending something valuable. I was just defending my own assumptions." Naomi didn't rush to fill the space. She let the words hang between them, giving Margaret room to feel the weight of them. "It's not about whether you were civil," Naomi said at last. "It's about whether you were fair. You can be polite and still be unjust." Margaret looked down at her hands. "You're right." Ruth's voice came from behind, gentle but unyielding. "If you want to make it right, use your position to tell the truth about what happened here. People will listen to you who might not listen to Naomi because you've been where they are." Margaret turned slightly toward Ruth, then back to Naomi. "I will." For a few moments, the only sound was the soft clink of cups as Lena poured coffee and tea. The cabin had shifted into a strange sort of unity, still strangers, still traveling in their own directions, but bound now by something they had all witnessed. Jonathan closed his laptop and leaned back, folding his arms. "What you're doing, Naomi, it's not just an airline policy thing, it's a leadership thing. Most people in power, when they're challenged, they react fast to protect themselves. You let it breathe. That's rare." Naomi smiled faintly. "Sometimes you learn more by listening than by winning quickly." Dr. Morales chuckled softly. "And sometimes listening is the way you win." Naomi thought about that. In her years, short as they were, she had learned that power wasn't just about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about knowing when to let others speak until they revealed exactly where they stood. As the minutes passed, passengers began to return to their own routines. Ruth reopened her newspaper, though she still glanced over the top of it now and then. Jonathan pulled out a pair of headphones but didn't put them on right away. Dr. Morales returned to his notes, his pen moving slowly across the page. Naomi took the quiet opportunity to open her tablet again, drafting an internal memo to Denise Clark. The subject line read, "Immediate implementation of passenger dignity protocol." She began outlining the new measures she had described earlier: mandatory training, reporting channels, zero-tolerance enforcement. She typed quickly but deliberately, the words carrying the weight of everything she had just lived through in the past hour. From the corner of her eye, she saw Margaret still sitting quietly, her hands folded, her expression thoughtful. Naomi wondered what conversations Margaret would have after this flight, and whether those conversations would carry honesty or defensiveness. She chose to believe in the possibility of change as she typed. Naomi thought of her mother, who used to tell her, "When you're in a room where no one expects you to be, your presence is already a statement. What you do there decides what the statement means." Today, she knew exactly what her presence had meant. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the flight's progress. 2 hours until landing. Naomi saved the document on her tablet and leaned back in her seat. The work would continue on the ground. But, for now, the first steps had been taken at 37,000 feet. Naomi adjusted her seat upright and placed her tablet on the table where everyone nearby could see. She wasn't trying to put on a show. She wanted to be transparent. If change was going to start here, it had to be visible. She tapped the screen, and the memo she had begun earlier filled the display. The heading read, "Passenger Dignity Protocol, Immediate Implementation." Ruth leaned forward slightly. "What are you writing a policy draft?" Naomi said. "By the time we land, I want a framework in place. This won't wait until the next board meeting." Jonathan gave a low whistle. "You move fast. I have to," Naomi replied. "If I let this sit for a week, it becomes just another story. It needs to turn into action while the memory is still sharp." Lena Park stepped closer. "What's in the protocol?" Naomi looked up at her. "First, mandatory unconscious bias training for all customer-facing staff. Not once a year a full course at onboarding and regular refreshers. Second, a direct passenger reporting line, staffed by people trained to recognize discrimination. Third, a zero-tolerance policy for harassment disguised as concern. That means if a passenger behaves like this again, there will be consequences." Ruth nodded approvingly. "It's specific. That's what makes it real." Margaret shifted in her seat, speaking softly. "You're talking about holding passengers accountable, too." "Yes," Naomi said without hesitation. "Airlines hold passengers to rules about safety, conduct, and respect for crew. Respect for fellow passengers should be just as important. If you break that standard, you risk losing your access to certain services." Margaret's eyes lowered again. "I understand." Dr. Morales rested his elbows on his knees. "I can contribute medical context to the training. There are situations in hospitals where bias literally costs lives. The parallels are strong. Sometimes we're making snap judgments about who's supposed to be there. And those judgments are wrong." Naomi's fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. That perspective would be invaluable. Jonathan leaned back, studying her. "You know, this is going to draw media attention. It'll be in your favor." "Sure. But it also means your opponents. Anyone who doesn't like you or your leadership will try to spin it." "I'm ready for that," Naomi said. "If they want to challenge me for enforcing dignity, they can go right ahead." There was a brief lull as Lena poured coffee for Ruth and tea for Dr. Morales. The act felt almost symbolic service continuing, but under a new understanding. Naomi glanced at Margaret again. "You said earlier, you've defended this airline for years. If you mean that, then help me now. When this protocol rolls out, I need passengers who can speak from experience about why it matters. People will dismiss it if they think it's just a CEO pushing her own agenda. They need to hear it from someone like you." Margaret hesitated, her fingers curling slightly into her palm. "I can do that. I don't like the way I behaved today, but if talking about it helps keep it from happening to someone else, then I'll do it." Ruth's voice came low but firm. "Then you're already doing better than most." The cabin was quieter now, but not with avoidance. It was the kind of quiet that meant people were thinking. Even passengers who hadn't spoken were clearly engaged, their body language open, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Naomi. Naomi returned to her drafting, but she spoke as she worked. This incident isn't unique. The faces change, the details change, but the pattern is the same. Someone sees a person who doesn't match their internal picture of who belongs in a space, and they act on it. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's loud, but it happens everywhere, Dr. Morales added, and the harm isn't just in the moment, it's cumulative. Every time it happens, it leaves a mark. Naomi nodded. Exactly. That's why I want this training to include real passenger stories, not anonymous examples, real voices, real details. It's harder to ignore something when it has a name and a face. Jonathan leaned forward. If you need a platform to launch this publicly, I can connect you with some media outlets I trust, ones that won't twist it. I'll take you up on that, Naomi said, without looking away from her screen. Margaret cleared her throat quietly. I still can't believe I reacted the way I did. I walked onto this plane thinking I understood what fairness meant. Now I see I've only understood it when it was easy. Naomi looked at her directly. Fairness is easiest when it doesn't cost you anything. The test is when it does. Margaret didn't look away, and I failed. You can still pass, Naomi said, but it's not a one-time thing. It's a choice you make over and over. There was a long pause. Then Ruth smiled faintly at Naomi. You're younger than my granddaughter, but you're talking like you've been doing this work for 50 years. Naomi's lips curved slightly. Some lessons don't wait for age. She tapped a final line into the memo draft to be reviewed by Executive Office upon landing. Immediate implementation pending. She sent it to Denise Clark with a short voice note. Denise, this is priority 1. I want the board to see it before the end of the day. Her phone buzzed a few moments later with a reply. Got it. We'll be ready. Naomi closed her tablet and looked around the cabin. She could feel the shift more clearly now. It wasn't total transformation. People didn't change that quickly, but it was movement. Seeds planted. She let herself lean back, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She thought again of her mother's words about what it meant to be in a room where no one expected you. Today, she hadn't just been in that room, she had reshaped it. Naomi could feel it, the subtle shift from confrontation to something more fluid, like water finding its way into new spaces. The cabin had quieted, but it wasn't the strained quiet from before. Now it felt active, as though people were processing, connecting invisible threads between what they'd just seen and their own lives. Jonathan Reeves was the first to break it. He angled his laptop toward her again, a different window open this time. It was a draft email to 3 high-profile journalists he knew personally. I haven't hit send, he said, but I think this is worth putting on their radar. I can keep your name out of it until you're ready. Naomi scanned the screen briefly. You can use my name. If we're going to have this conversation, hiding behind anonymity only tells people it's something to be ashamed of. And it isn't. Jonathan nodded, deleting the line about an unnamed passenger. Got it. Across the aisle, Dr. Morales had pulled out his phone. He wasn't taking pictures or videos. Instead, he was typing notes into a medical forum he moderated. Naomi overheard a line of what he was writing. What we saw today is exactly how bias manifests in real time. Different setting, same patterns. She made a mental note to connect him with the team who would develop the training modules. Having medical parallels would add weight. Margaret, still seated 2 rows away, finally reached for her bag and pulled out a slim leather notebook. She opened it, pen in hand, and began writing. Naomi didn't stare, but she caught a glimpse of the first words. When I was wrong at 37,000 feet, Lena Park moved quietly between suites, checking on passengers but clearly staying within Naomi's line of sight. She stopped by Naomi's seat, her voice pitched low. I've worked this route for 3 years. I've seen people make passengers feel unwelcome, but it's usually brushed off. What happened today, it's going to stick with me. That's why we act now. Naomi said, if it sticks for you, it can change the way you see things before they escalate next time. A few rows back, Ruth Calderon was folding her newspaper carefully. When she looked up, she caught Naomi's eye and gave the smallest nod, the kind you might give a witness who'd just delivered flawless testimony. Passengers who had been silent the whole flight were starting to approach in subtle ways. One man stopped on his way to the restroom and simply said, "Thank you," before moving on. A younger woman in business attire leaned in to whisper, "I've been there. More than once. It matters that you spoke up." Naomi accepted each comment without deflecting. She knew that sometimes acknowledging thanks was as important as giving it. Jonathan closed his laptop, sliding it into his bag. "The moment we land, this will be in motion," he said, "not just as a headline, but as a conversation piece in boardrooms. I'll make sure of it." Naomi didn't smile, but her eyes warmed. That's how you make the ripples count. Margaret hesitated before standing and moving to Naomi's suite. She didn't sit. She remained just inside the aisle, as though aware she was stepping into someone else's space. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she began, "but I've been thinking about what you said about fairness being easy until it costs you something. I'm going to talk about this. Not in the way that makes me look better, but in the way that tells the truth. People like me need to hear it from people like me." Naomi studied her for a moment. "If you mean that, then you're already doing the work." Margaret exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for an hour. She returned to her seat without another word, but her shoulders looked lighter. Naomi took out her phone and opened a message thread with Denise Clark. She typed quickly. "Board meeting immediately upon landing. Draft protocol sent. Begin outreach to civil rights organizations. I want them in the loop before the press release." Denise replied within minutes. "Understood. Press team on standby." For the first time since the incident began, Naomi allowed herself a small moment of stillness. She rested her head back, letting the steady hum of the engines fill the space. She thought of her mother's voice again, the lessons about presence and purpose, and she thought about how quickly these moments could slip away if no one sees them. The stillness didn't last long. Her phone vibrated with another message from Denise. "One more thing, media outlets already calling. You'll have cameras at JFK." Naomi typed back, "Good, let them see." Lena returned once more with water and a folded napkin. "I figured you could use this," she said, placing it on Naomi's table. "It's clean, but it's also a gesture. Something about serving you now feels different." Naomi looked at her. "Because it's not just service, it's solidarity." Lena smiled faintly. "Exactly." As Lena moved away, Ruth spoke again, her voice carrying just enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "Don't underestimate the power of what just happened here. Most people go through life never seeing themselves clearly. today, some people did. Naomi turned slightly toward her, and that's the start. Seeing it is the first step to changing it. The captain's voice broke through the moment, announcing that they were beginning their initial descent toward New York. Seatbelt signs lit up. Conversation slowed, but the undercurrent was still there, the sense that this was more than just a flight. Margaret closed her notebook, tucking it into her bag. Jonathan slipped his phone into his jacket pocket. Dr. Morales sat back, looking thoughtful. Naomi, meanwhile, kept her tablet on, fingers poised to send the final draft of the passenger dignity protocol the moment the wheels touched the runway. She didn't know exactly how the world would respond once the story got out, but she knew this by the time flight AS921 landed. The conversation had already begun. The descent was smooth. The cabin lights dimmed to that soft glow meant to ease passengers back into the rhythm of the ground. But Naomi's mind was already ahead of the landing gear. She could feel the weight of what waited on the other side of the jet bridge. When the landing gear thudded against the runway, the cabin seemed to exhale collectively. A few passengers clapped softly, a habit Naomi never understood, but the sound faded quickly into the shuffle of people unbuckling, reaching for bags, glancing at phones. Naomi stayed seated. She'd learned long ago that leaving first wasn't always the smartest move when the cameras were waiting. Better to let the initial rush pass, to step into the moment with composure instead of being swept in by it. Jonathan Reeves leaned toward her. "Just so you know, I caught a glimpse out the window. Press is definitely here. Looks like half a dozen cameras at least." Naomi nodded, unsurprised. "That's fine. We set the tone. Not them." Margaret, seated a few rows forward, twisted in her seat to look back. "If you want, I can walk with you. Not to overshadow, but to stand there. Let people see I was part of this, and that I'm owning my role in it." Naomi considered it for a beat. "If you're ready to speak truthfully, then yes. But remember, this isn't about protecting me from criticism. It's about making sure the real lesson gets out." "I understand," Margaret said, her voice steady. The chime sounded, and the seatbelt light blinked off. Passengers began to move in that half-polite, half-impatient way people always did when the door was still closed. Naomi stayed still, letting Ruth and Dr. O'Morales pass her row with nods. Lena Park paused at her side. "You're going to be all over the news by dinner time," Lena said quietly. Naomi smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure it's for the right reasons." When the door finally opened, the humid air of New York in late summer rushed in. The line of passengers in the aisle crept forward. Naomi rose only when the flow had thinned, her carry-on already ready in hand. Margaret waited just beyond the curtain, matching her pace. The jet bridge felt shorter than it usually did. Naomi could already see the press cluster at the terminal entrance, their lenses angled like a field of sunflowers tracking a patch of light. A uniformed airport staffer stepped forward, voice low but urgent. "Ms. Ellison, the media is right outside the door. We can route you through a side exit if you'd prefer." "No," Naomi said. "We'll go through." The staffer hesitated but didn't argue. The moment Naomi and Margaret stepped into the terminal, the noise hit. Questions flying from every direction, the flash of bulbs, the shuffle of reporters trying to edge closer without crossing that invisible line that would get them pulled back. "Naomi, is it true you were challenged for sitting in first class, Margaret? Can you comment on your role in the incident, Ms. Ellison? Are you taking legal action?" Naomi raised her hand slightly. not a defensive gesture, but a call for space. The noise dropped just enough for her voice to carry. "Yes," she said, her tone calm but clear. I was challenged for sitting in the seat I was assigned, not because of a ticketing error, not because of a misunderstanding about boarding, but because someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong there. That's what happened. She glanced at Margaret, giving her a subtle nod. Margaret took a breath, and that someone was me. I made an assumption based on what I saw, not on any fact. It was wrong. I've apologized to Ms. Ellison, but I'm here because I believe the public needs to hear from people like me who've made these mistakes. We have to own them if we want to change. The air in the terminal shifted. Reporters weren't expecting that. Pens scratched harder against notepads. Recorders tilted forward. Naomi continued. I am the CEO and majority shareholder of Atlas Skyways. That's not the point, though. The point is that no one should have to justify their right to be in a space they've already earned access to. Not me. Not anyone. A question came from the back of the group. What's your next step? Naomi didn't hesitate. The passenger dignity protocol goes into effect immediately. That means mandatory bias training for all staff, a direct passenger reporting line, and consequences for discriminatory behavior, whether it comes from crew or passengers. Atlas Skyways will set this standard, and I encourage every airline to match it. Jonathan appeared at her side, speaking just loud enough for the nearest cameras to pick up, and I'll be making sure the business community knows about it. This isn't just an airline issue, it's a leadership issue. Ruth Calderon, who had stayed a few paces back, stepped forward now. As a retired civil rights attorney, I can tell you policy matters, but so does public accountability. Today, you're seeing both. The press shouted more questions, but Naomi knew when to draw the line. That's all for now. She said, You'll have the full press release within the hour. With that, she turned and walked toward the exit. Margaret, still beside her, the cameras following until the automatic doors closed behind them and the humid air of the city took over. Outside, a black sedan waited. The driver stepped forward to take Naomi's bag. She turned to Margaret before getting in. If you meant what you said in there, then you'll have opportunities to prove it. Margaret nodded. I'm counting on it. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Naomi leaned back against the seat. The city blurred past, but her mind was already on the work ahead. The incident on Flight AS921 was over, but the real challenge turning a moment into a movement was just beginning. By the time Naomi's sedan reached Midtown, the headlines had already spread across every major news site. Clips from the terminal were looping on social media feeds, each one captioned with some variation of Atlas Skyways CEO confronts passenger bias. Inside the car, Naomi scrolled through her phone, the speed of notifications making it almost impossible to focus on any single one. Messages from board members, allies in other industries, friends she hadn't heard from in years. Some were congratulatory, some concerned, all urgent. Margaret had parted ways at the terminal, but not before exchanging numbers with Naomi's assistant, Denise Clark. Naomi suspected that was the first step in what might become a surprisingly useful partnership if Margaret followed through. When the car stopped in front of Atlas Skyways headquarters, Naomi paused before getting out. Take the side entrance, she told the driver. The front will be a zoo right now. Sure enough. As they rounded the block, she saw the cluster of cameras and microphones waiting at the main doors. even though she'd just addressed the press at JFK. The appetite for fresh footage was insatiable. Inside, Denise was already waiting in the executive suite. "Board's in the conference room," she said without preamble. "They've all seen the footage. Most are supportive. A couple are nervous about backlash." Naomi stepped into her office long enough to set down her bag and take a breath. Then she walked straight into the boardroom. The conversation stopped the moment she entered. Screens around the room showed still images from the incident Naomi at the terminal podium. Margaret speaking beside her, Jonathan in the background. One of the older board members, a man named Russell Harding, spoke first. "Naomi, we respect what you're trying to do, but this could alienate high-value customers who don't like being told they're part of the problem." Naomi leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "If those customers believe being held to a standard of respect is a problem, then they're not the kind of customers who define our value." There was a beat of silence before another director, Mei Chen, chimed in. "I agree, and the public response is overwhelmingly positive. Our social media engagement is up by 400% in the last 3 hours. People are calling this a leadership moment." Naomi nodded to Denise, who had queued up the passenger dignity protocol draft. "This is the policy we'll announce officially in the next 2 hours. It's already being reviewed by our legal team. The rollout will begin with immediate crew training and the establishment of the reporting line." Russell looked unconvinced. "Do we have to call it bias training? That term alone can set people off." "We call it what it is," Naomi said. "If the language makes someone uncomfortable, that's the first sign they need it." The room went quiet again. Naomi could feel the shift, not total agreement, but reluctant acceptance. Denise broke the tension by passing around tablets loaded with the protocol outline. "I've also contacted civil rights organizations and diversity consultants to partner on content creation for the training modules. We want this to be industry-leading, not just a box-checking exercise." Naomi straightened. "This isn't reactive PR. This is structural change. And if we lead, others will follow, or they'll be compared unfavorably to us." Across the city, the story was evolving in real time. Talk show hosts were replaying Naomi's press conference. Commentators debated whether her approach was bold or risky. Hashtags like Jack Dignity, In the Air, and Flight AS921 were trending worldwide. Jonathan Reeves called midway through the meeting. "Your message is resonating. Corporate leaders are texting me about adapting similar protocols in their own companies." "You've lit something bigger than you think." Naomi allowed herself a small smile. "Good. That's the point." By early evening, the first wave of public response was undeniable. Influencers who had never mentioned air travel policy were weighing in. Civil rights advocates were praising the initiative. Even some competitors in the airline industry were issuing statements carefully worded. But acknowledgments nonetheless. Naomi's communications team worked in a steady rhythm, monitoring coverage, responding to press inquiries, and amplifying supportive voices. Denise kept the flow organized, filtering out noise so Naomi could focus on strategy. At one point, Naomi paused by the floor-to-ceiling window in her office. The city spread out below, pulsing with the energy of a million separate stories. She thought of the cabin earlier that day, the mix of disbelief, defensiveness, and awakening. She thought of Margaret's notebook, Ruth's approving nod, Lena's quiet solidarity. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Margaret. "I just recorded a statement for a business ethics podcast. I told the whole truth, no excuses. Naomi replied simply, "That's the start." As night fell, Naomi gathered her senior leadership team for a final huddle before the public rollout. When this goes live, it's not just about us. This is going to become a reference point for the entire industry. People will cite Flight AS921 for years. The question is whether they'll cite it as a turning point or a missed opportunity. The room was quiet. Then Mei Chen said, "It will be a turning point. Because you're not just talking about change, you're making it happen in real time." Naomi glanced at the clock. Less than an hour until the official announcement. The first wave had been public reaction. The second would be the actual implementation. And she knew that second wave would be even more important. Before dismissing the team, she left them with a single line. This started on a plane, but it doesn't end there. From here on, every passenger who steps onto an Atlas Skyways flight should know they're stepping into a space where dignity isn't optional, it's guaranteed. The announcement went live at 8 p.m. Eastern. Naomi sat at the head of the polished conference table, flanked by Denise and the communications team, as the live stream began broadcasting across every major platform. The Atlas Skyways logo pulsed softly in the background. Naomi didn't use a script. She knew this story didn't need rehearsed lines. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady, deliberate. "Today, something happened aboard Flight AS921, an incident that could have been dismissed as a misunderstanding. But that's not what it was. It was an example of how bias, conscious or not, can rob someone of their dignity in a matter of seconds. And I believe we have a responsibility to address it, not only as an airline but as a company built on human connection." She let the silence hang for a breath before continuing. "As of tonight, Atlas Skyways is adopting the Passenger Dignity Protocol. This means 3 things. First, mandatory bias awareness training for every crew member, manager, and contractor. Second, a direct reporting system for passengers who feel they've experienced discrimination. Third, clear and enforceable consequences when those reports are validated. We will not treat this as a PR issue. We will treat it as a core safety and service standard because dignity is safety." She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of the words settled over the room. "This policy will not make us perfect, but it will make us accountable. And I invite every airline to join us in adopting similar measures. The air belongs to everyone. Our cabins should reflect that." The live stream ended with the new protocol displayed on screen in the simple, unambiguous language. By the time Naomi left the conference room, her phone was buzzing with messages from CEOs, journalists, and civil rights leaders. Some wanted interviews, others offered congratulations. A few asked pointed questions about how the policy would be enforced. Naomi welcomed all of it. Outside her office window, the city was a scatter of lights. Somewhere down there, people were scrolling through their feeds, watching the clip from the terminal or the live stream just now. Some would agree with her. Some would argue. But the conversation had begun, and that was the real victory. Denise stepped in with the latest coverage report. CNN just called it the boldest move by a major airline in a decade. Social media sentiment is 78% positive. The hashtag #MoreDignity in the Air has passed 1 million uses. Naomi smiled faintly, and the rest of the sentiment, some skepticism, some outright pushback, mostly from people who think this is about politics instead of basic respect. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Then they just proved why we need it. Jonathan Reeves called a few minutes later. "The business community is watching this like a live case study. I've already had 2 major corporations ask for introductions to your policy team. You're setting a precedent." "That's the goal," Naomi said, "not just to change one airline, but to set a bar others can't ignore." By midnight, the story had reached international outlets. The Guardian, Al Jazeera, and Le Monde all carried versions of it. Naomi skimmed a few headlines but didn't dwell. She knew the media cycle would keep spinning whether she watched or not. Instead, she sat alone in her office for a few quiet minutes. The hum of the city below a soft backdrop. Her mind drifted back to the cabin of AS921, the flash of disbelief in Margaret's eyes. The calm resolve she'd forced into her own voice. The moment when silence broke and the truth was spoken aloud. She thought, too, about the passengers who had said nothing but had watched closely, about Lena Park, who had shifted from procedural caution to quiet solidarity, about Ruth Calderon's nod of approval, about Dr. Morales connecting the dots to his own work in medicine. She realized something then. The incident had unfolded in less than an hour, but the ripples would stretch far beyond the flight's path. That was the nature of moments like these. They didn't end when the plane touched down. The next morning, Naomi boarded another Atlas Skyways flight, this time to Washington, D.C., where she had been invited to brief the Department of Transportation on the new protocol. As she settled into her seat first class, as always, she noticed a young black woman boarding with a toddler. The woman glanced at her ticket, then at the seat beside Naomi. Naomi smiled and shifted slightly, making space. "You're in 2A. The woman returned the smile, a little surprised. "Yes, I am." "Welcome," Naomi said simply. They exchanged no further words, but Naomi saw the way the woman relaxed as she settled the toddler into her lap. It was such a small thing, a non-event, really, and yet Naomi knew that in some other version of the world, it might not have been. As the plane lifted off, Naomi looked out the window at the shrinking city below. The air did belong to everyone, and now, so did this moment. Somewhere in her mind, she heard her mother's voice again. "Power isn't about who sits where. It's about who changes the rules so everyone can sit without question." Naomi closed her eyes, letting that truth settle. Flight AS921 had started as an ordinary trip and ended as a turning point. And, if she had her way, it would be remembered not for the confrontation, but for the change it sparked. She wasn't naive. There would be more pushback, more difficult conversations, more people who clung to the idea that first class belonged to some and not others. But now there was a policy, a precedent, and a public expectation. The bar had been raised. When the seatbelt sign switched off, Naomi reached for her notebook and wrote a single line at the top of the page. "This is only the beginning." Sometimes, the loudest statement is made without raising your voice. Naomi Ellison could have ended that flight in silence. She could have brushed it off, walked away, and carried the weight alone. But she didn't. She turned a moment of humiliation into a blueprint for change, not just for herself, but for every passenger who has ever been told, in words or in silence, "You don't belong here." The passenger dignity protocol is now a reality. And because of one young woman's quiet courage, an industry is rethinking how it treats the people it serves. But this isn't just Naomi's story. It's a reminder to every one of us our dignity is not negotiable, and when we defend it calmly, firmly, and without compromise, we give others permission to do the same. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you think, talk about it. And if you want to hear more stories that challenge injustice and celebrate quiet strength, like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your next story starts here.